The media continued to try to make a big deal out of this not very big deal. The kerfuffle, the flap, I don't know what you want to call it at this point, but the use of Signal, an encrypted messaging service that is in fact preloaded on government devices when people join the federal government and work in the executive branch. It's obviously an approved platform. But that conversation that happened during the military strike against the Houthis, set up by Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, and participated with all the top people. They want Waltz to be fired. They want Hegseth to be fired. They want heads to roll. And yet there's one talking point that we've seen now finally start to come through here that silences critics in their tracks. It's the one thing that nobody has an answer to. You think somebody should be fired because of a successful military strike against terrorists that Biden didn't do anything about. You think someone should be fired because they had a conversation on the encrypted Signal app regarding that successful military strike. But what about the 13? What am I talking about? Well, I'll let Stephen A. Smith, of all people, who has been slowly morphing his sports-oriented podcast into a sports pop culture political podcast. I'll let him make the case. What about the 13?
But when we want to sit up there and look at the latest controversy that they're involved in terms of national security information, in terms of attacking the Houthis, with Mr. Hegseth himself, who to me falls under a DEI category, by the way. And we want to talk about this man being fired. Were y'all talking about people being fired when Biden pulled troops out of Afghanistan? When at least 13 lives were lost? When billions in equipment were left in Afghanistan? The sloppy manner in which we parted ways? Were you talking about the same thing then? Because this ain't worse than that.
That's right. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has to be fired because he talked about details of a military strike against the Houthis, terrorists that had gone unabated against our military for 4 years under Joe Biden. And yet, when we had our slipshod, embarrassing, deadly withdrawal of our military from Afghanistan, and 13 service members were murdered, and not one person lost their job, not Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, not Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor. Nobody lost their job. Nobody got fired. Nobody got demoted. When 13 service members were murdered on Joe Biden's watch because of their incompetence. And you want somebody to lose their job over using the Signal app? What about the 13? What about the 13 service members? If you had nothing to say about that then, you have absolutely nothing to say about this now. Scott Jennings, CNN. What about the 13?
Isn't cowboys and Indians and calling for scalps. This is actually what most people would think was, if someone has behaved in a way that puts American lives at risk, they should be held accountable for it.
Scott, what's your response?
Laura, may I, since she addressed me, I'll answer it.
Please.
In a Democratic, you don't have to make up hypotheticals, Lulu, about if this happened in a Democratic administration. Let me take you back in time. In a Democratic administration, the Secretary of Defense oversaw a disastrous military operation in which 13 servicemen died in Afghanistan. Then, to try to make up for it, they vaporized like 7 children in a drone strike. Then later, the Secretary of Defense went AWOL and didn't even tell the commander-in-chief.
This is a completely different thing.
You don't have to come up with a hypothetical, Lulu, because the bar apparently is very high for dismissing a Secretary of Defense.
I don't want your words to fall on ears that cannot hear you. Lulu, what's your reaction?
My reaction is, it's not the same thing. I can take you back in time and talk about the Iraq War.
You're right, because people died.
People
died in the last case and not in this
make
case.
Mistakes. This was using an unsecure method of discussion by the top members of this administration to discuss top secret a top secret and
Who
very
in which
important
case did people die?
military
In which
I would
case
like
did
to
people die?
hear her finish her points, Pat.
Yeah, she's reduced to babbling nonsense because there is no coherent argument against that. What about the 13? And again, let me take you back to the beginning where she makes her case why somebody should get fired over this signal flap kerfuffle BS. Listen to her words.
Isn't cowboys and Indians and calling for scalps. This is actually what most people would think was if someone has behaved in a way that puts American lives at risk, they should be held accountable for it.
So if somebody behaves in a way that puts American lives at risk, they should be held accountable. Puts American lives at risk. Literally 13 service members lost their life because of their incompetence, their misjudgment, their hubris, their arrogance. They didn't put lives at risk. They literally lost their lives. And she says, oh, well, that's different. That's completely different. Oh, I see. So if Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had been discussing the strategy for the Afghanistan pullout on Signal, and that led to 13 lives lost, then people should be fired. But if they discussed it on a secure line, and then people literally got killed, they're fine. They're off scot-free. You have to be a liberal Democrat to think in these terms. It literally makes no sense. They have absolutely no logical basis for their argument because they're blinded by political hatred. And they're just trying to find something, anything, because they've got nothing. What about the 13? Senator Mark Warner, Virginia, I'm told that he's a very serious man. This is a man who claimed he was only going to run for 2 terms in Virginia. He's now in the middle of his 4th term. There's a word for that. He's a liar. And he's trying to make the case that somebody should get fired over the signal flap. Joe Kernan, CNBC. What about the 13?
You remember the Biden administration started with the biggest F-up in history with Afghanistan and 13 dead Americans. Let's not get too sanctimonious and high and mighty about screwing up, Senator.
Go back even to...
Okay, that's only 4 years. That's only 4 years, Senator.
I'm surprised, Joe. You're not going to throw in. You're not going to throw in.
Yeah, I am. I just
the Hillary servers. But let's, Joe.
She wiped that clean with a cloth. Remember?
Acknowledge.
No, I do.
This was a screw up.
I do.
If the Houthis, the bombing was a success. God bless. Thank God, the person on the line wasn't an Iranian spy, and they could have given that to the Houthis, and that bombing success might have turned into something that cost American lives. At least acknowledge that's what's at stake. And if that kind of mistake is made, and I go back to what I said in the earlier teaser, if this was a military officer or a CIA case officer, their butts would be fired.
And yet nobody got fired over Afghanistan, and there were officers involved in that, and there were CIA case officers involved with that. So Mark Warner is more concerned about the encrypted platform that was used to discuss this thing, which, by the way, it didn't include the details that they did talk about on what is quoted in the Signal chat as the high side, which is the higher level secure form of communication. So they were fully aware of what should be discussed. Yet this is nonsense. They're making up a complete and total fraudulent argument here. But he had no answer on what about the 13. All he said was, oh, that was 4 years ago. Really? And what was he laughing about, by the way? What's with all the smiles and laughter? Look at him. Look at him. Look at his laughter over the loss of 13 service members. He doesn't care about them. What about the 13? He has no answer other than, oh, that was then, this is now. Let's let JD Vance have the last word on this because he brought it up too. Once again, in the context of people going nuts about the Signal chat. He was part of the Signal chat, and he has a pretty fair argument about this. It's the theme of this segment. What about the 13?
I find the American media's obsession with this issue very, very interesting because I happen to remember about 4 years ago when American military leadership made a catastrophic error that got 13 innocent Americans killed in Afghanistan and had about $80 billion of military equipment turned over to one of the worst terrorist organizations in the world. And for years, the American media ran cover for a Biden administration that refused to fire any generals or even launch an internal investigation that was meaningful and substantive about what happened. And now the same American media that covered for the Biden administration after the untimely death and the unnecessary death of 13 brave Americans is really, really interested in forcing the president of the United States to fire someone because of a signal chat, That is not honest behavior from the American media. And if you think you're going to force the president of the United States to fire anybody, you've got another thing coming. President Trump has said it on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday. And I'm the vice president saying it here on Friday. We are standing behind our entire national security team.
Thank you. In fact, the way Trump told Kristen Welker on this, as she pressed it to, are you going to fire somebody or fire somebody? He said, no, I don't fire people over fake news and witch hunts. What you just heard from JD Vance is 100% accurate. This is complete and total disingenuous bullshit. They know it, by the way. They're just trying to change the subject because Trump has soaring popularity. His policies are incredibly popular with the American people, and they're trying to drum up a fake scandal to steal the headlines. And what JD Vance didn't say when he said this is just dishonest behavior from the media, what he meant to say, I'll say it. They're all shameless liars.